Jobless claims coming in lower than expected today, easing some of the fears that the recent uptick was a sign of further deterioration in the labor market. However, when you take a look at continuing claims, those increased to nearly 1.9 million, the most in almost 3 years. And this data coming after the Fed Beige Book earlier this week pointed to a softer view of the U.S. economy. And that, of course, comes in contrast with some of that most recent hard data. For more on where things stand, we want to bring in Paul Krugman. He's an economist, New York Times op-ed columnist and recipient of the 2008 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. Paul, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I threw Fed in there because Fed is obviously top of mind when we're talking about the economy and trying to figure out where things stand. I'm curious from your perspective, just given the conflicting economic data that we have gotten, what shape do you think the economy is in right now?
Overall, we're in great shape. We're coming, ask me again after we know who won the election, but we're coming in fundamentally, inflation has been defeated. There is no recession. So we're now really talking about things at the margin. Is the economy slowing? High frequency data can tell you pretty much whatever you want to hear. What will the Fed's pace of rate cuts be? It's going to depend on, this hard to interpret data and maybe what they had for breakfast. So fundamentally, we went through this great cycle of high inflation and fears of recession, and we came out the other end in a really pretty good place.
So, Paul, are we in the middle of a soft landing in your view?
Oh, yeah. I think that if you really try to look through all of the data issues, the seasonal adjustments and so on, we basically soft landed almost a year ago. And we're basically been in that place ever since.
So, Paul, then I guess how much is riding on that next rate cut? Would it be a mistake? Could the Fed, if the Fed were to stay on the sidelines in November, would that jeopardize maybe how much progress has been made?
Any individual rate decision doesn't make that much difference. The interest rates that matter for economic activity are long-term interest rates, which depend upon the whole expected future course of Fed policy, not on what it did in a particular meeting. You can see that the impact of that jumbo rate cut on long rates was, kind of transitory because then the economy looked a little stronger. Whatever. So I don't obsess much about what the Fed will do at its next meeting. Unless the environment changes radically, which could happen from the election, but unless the environment changes radically, it's hard to see that the Fed won't continue to cut rates over the next year or two because inflation is looking pretty solidly on track to the Fed's target.
How much control does the Fed have over the economy with the two levers they have at their disposal? And I ask in the context of what we're seeing in 30-year mortgage rates ticking up despite that 50 basis point cut. To what extent does monetary policy have the ability to help out folks who are just not able to afford homes right now?
Well, in the end, the Fed is, I'm going to sound like an economist here, the Fed's an endogenous variable. The Fed responds to conditions. And we're seeing mortgage rates, long 10-year rates ticking up, partly because of the economy's perceived strength, partly because of concerns about greatly expanded budget deficits. Sorry, I don't mean to be political here, though obviously I am, but if you look at the Trump program, it's kind of like pandemic 2.0. It's we're going to reduce the labor force with mass deportations. We're going to provide a major inflationary shock with tariffs. So if you think that there's a substantial chance of that happening, of course it's going to drive up long-term interest rates. That's not saying that the Fed doesn't matter. It's saying that people think that the Fed will respond to possible big changes in the economic environment.
Well, Paul, you've teased this a few times and you briefly mentioned it there, but the election and the outcome really could have a substantial impact, in your view, on the economic direction, on the economy going forward. And I want to bring this up in the context of a new Wall Street Journal poll that was just released and was comparing the Harris agenda versus the Trump agenda and asking voters, the survey here, who they trust the most. And what was interesting, and I know you're going to disagree with this, is that voters appear to have adopted a more positive view of Trump's agenda and past performance, more negative views of Harris, and specifically having a bit more confidence in Trump's ability to handle the economy and inflation. What's your reaction to that? What do you think? And I guess how big of a concern is that for Harris with less than 2 weeks from the election?
Well, different polls are giving you different stories there. And we all know that the polling is an exact art, and I have no idea about the electoral consequences. Some polling suggests that it's a dead heat on the economy and inflation. Others are saying Trump with a large advantage. The economists, both academic and business economists, are overwhelmingly of the opinion that Trump will be much worse for the economy, especially on inflation. I mean, one survey from University of Chicago found that 70% of the economists surveyed thought that Trump would do worse for inflation. Only 3% thought that Harris would do worse for inflation. So the public's views are very much at odds with what people who actually have looked at the policies believe. But of course, people don't do economic analyses. People have memories that there was pre-pandemic and Trump was president and inflation was low, and people were really very shocked by what was in the end a fairly brief but really surprising bout of inflation under Biden. So who knows?
Well, one group that maybe knows at least how they're feeling right now is CEOs surveyed by the Conference Board this morning, talking about increased pessimism surrounding both the potential impact of tariffs and corporate taxes. So I wanted to get your take on kind of the differing impact between those two. Which do you think could have a bigger impact on the broader economy? Because you talk about tariffs being inflationary, but could increased tax cuts for corporations potentially have the opposite impact?
Well, we've seen what happened. We had substantial corporate tax cuts in 2017, and it's just not obvious in the data that they had any impact. Now, maybe there's something in there. Maybe maybe if you squint hard enough, there's some impact on business investment. But in general, the evidence suggests that corporate tax changes in the range that we're talking about do not actually do much to move business investment, do not do much to move the economy. On the other hand, we're talking about the tariff issue is enormous. We're talking about a radical break, not just with recent economic policy, but a radical break with 90 years of U.S. support for an increasing trade. We're talking about an inflationary shock that is bigger than almost anything else that you could do through federal policy. So the tariff thing, and when you combine that again with mass deportation, those would be really, really big negative shocks to the economy.
Paul, before we let you go, I would love to get your take on one of the big headlines out this week in regards to the election and maybe ultimately how some of the administrations could be shaping up. And the latest report being that potentially JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, he could be interested in joining Harris's administration. Lots of talk about potentially becoming Treasury Secretary. I'm curious, what are your thoughts of him potentially in that role?
Well, it's a funny thing. He's a great businessman. I'm not sure that means he would be a great Treasury Secretary. They're very, very different skill sets. I mean, thinking about it, when was the last time we had a genuinely great business person as president? And the answer is, well, Herbert Hoover. So I'm not sure. I think that Dimon does a great job in his job. I'm not sure that I would think that he necessarily has the quite different set of skills that are required to be an effective administration economic official.
You think he'd make a good president, Paul?
Oh, well, again, Herbert Hoover, right? I had no idea. But look, this is not going to happen. The reality is that maybe, I shouldn't say that. What do I know? But look, there are different spheres. Politics is one thing. You would not want me as a politician, right? Economic policy is another thing. Running a major business is another thing. There's no good reason to think that because somebody is good at one of these things, that they're going to be good at the other things. And this is a repeated delusion. We tend to assume that if you've made a lot of money, that you can be great at other things, and that is clearly just not the case.
All right, Paul Krugman, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.